So the TikTok star turned double murderer Ali Abulaban was supposed to be sentenced last week for the murder of his ex-wife and her friend, but that sentencing hearing was continued. His defense attorneys argued that they needed more time to prepare, while the prosecution was saying, no, we should move forward. The families need closure. And so the judge granted that motion for a continuance, basically saying, hey, I don't remember ever denying a first-time request for a continuance. In a case this serious, it's not out of the ordinary that the defense would request a continuance, needing more time. And this is just another tragic story, right? And you see this is a guy who had some really serious anger issues and some apparent jealousy issues, and just one of those things where perhaps if just a couple of decisions had been made differently, then we might not be here today. But from what I understand, in 2019, this guy, he started, his career in content creation. He was making videos under the name Gin Kid on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, where he just really blew up. And he and his wife, they ended up moving to San Diego. They end up around a different circle of friends. And interestingly enough, there were concerns about this relationship. The people around them were saying that, he was verbally abusive and he just had this way of making other people in the room feel uncomfortable. Sometimes he was condescending. There was evidence of abuse. And, actually this came out at trial. I saw a portion of the cross-examination where Taryn Brast was basically ripping into this guy, posting photos, pretty graphic photos of domestic abuse. And as a side note, this is an interesting issue because we handle a lot of domestic violence cases, and sometimes there's a desire for couples to not want to have police involved, to not want to have DAs involved or judges involved, and they just want to deal with it in-house, so to speak. But this is the exact example of how this can go wrong, right? When police don't get involved, or when DAs don't get involved, or when a person doesn't have restraining orders in place or criminal protective orders in place, or a person doesn't end up having to take domestic violence classes to where they can learn how they're making bad decisions and engaging in destructive behavior. Whereas if somebody would have gone through those channels, maybe we don't end up where we, unfortunately landed with this case. So when a person's in that situation, a couple, whether it's a wife who doesn't want her husband prosecuted or a girlfriend who doesn't want her boyfriend prosecuted, this is what you have to keep in mind. Or, the boyfriend that doesn't feel like he needs to be prosecuted. This is what DAs, judges, and police are trying to avoid. The situation where it starts off with, perhaps microaggressions and then turns into slaps or pushes, punches, and then escalates to more serious violence and then can come to a head, which results in a homicide. So, it's just something to keep in mind. There were, live videos on TikTok with Mr. Abulaban yelling at his wife, Anna, and, they were allegedly using drugs. He, apparently developed some sort of cocaine habit. And, when you mix that anger along with addiction, controlled substances, alcohol, it's just a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And so the relationship is essentially done. Anna has him leave the apartment in October of 2021. And so on October 25th, 2021, he ends up going to the apartment when she's not home. And it wasn't crystal clear, but I believe the DA alleged that he made some sort of copy of a key card in order to get in there. Nonetheless, he gets in the apartment, he vandalizes the unit, but while he's in there, he actually sets up his daughter's iPad to function basically as a listening device so he can spy on what's going on, and he puts it behind a bed. So, and this is just really setting yourself up for disappointment. Again, there's a lot of stops along the way where, ideally you just check yourself, surround yourself by good energy, good friends, family. You go find God, you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, you go to Narcotics Anonymous, you do all the things, right? Therapy, whatever it takes to get you on the right track, not basically setting yourself up for extreme disappointment. And no matter what he ended up finding out, obviously it doesn't justify taking anyone's life or reacting violently, but that's exactly what ultimately happened. And so apparently he ends up hearing on the app, he goes on this app and eventually hears the sound of Anna talking with another man. He ends up driving over to the apartment and he goes inside and finds Anna on the couch with Rayburn, right? So this was the other victim, and his testimony was that he just snapped when he saw them and he shot both of them with the handgun that he had on him. And he said, my gun was in my hand and the next thing I'm shooting and I can't stop. He opened the door and it was found that within just 3 seconds, he was firing this weapon. And after that, there was a recording of him calling his mother and basically confessing to having killed his wife. So he goes to the school, picks his daughter up, lets her know, I hurt mommy. And this is just absolutely heartbreaking, right? Because you have this little girl who, through no fault of her own, now loses both parents, right? Her mother is never coming back. She's dead. Her father will be in custody for the rest of his life, essentially. And, even if he somehow miraculously were to beat this case, can you imagine? I mean, like, what would she want to have to do with him at all, right? After having killed her mother. And so this is just such a tragedy. Oftentimes when you see cases like this where guilt seems very apparent, people are like, lock him up, throw away the key, no trial needed, and all of that. But you do have to understand, obviously, people have constitutional rights. They have a right to counsel. They have a right to trial. We don't get to pick and choose who gets a trial and who gets a good defense or not based on what they did. No, there's no exception to the Sixth Amendment right to counsel and your right to a fair trial. But kind of backing up a little bit, when the district attorney, when they file a case, right, typically they're going to file a criminal complaint and there will be an arraignment, right? And the person is going to plead not guilty. They're going to enter their not guilty pleas, deny all allegations, and eventually the DA is going to get the discovery over to the defense counsel. And that's going to be, police reports, witness statements, photographs, any videos, medical records, if it's that kind of case. And they'll get them all the information. And eventually the district attorney will make an offer to the defense, right? And that offer is going to be to settle the case. 90+% of cases, probably closer in the range of 94-95% of cases, result in some sort of plea arrangement, right? So the plea has to be attractive enough to make sense for the defense to accept it, right? Because if there were much more cases going to trial, the criminal justice system would completely grind to a halt because there simply would not be enough resources, enough courtrooms in order to process all these cases. So there has to be an incentive for both sides, right? The DA has to feel like they're getting enough in terms of rehabilitation, punishment, teaching a lesson, sending a message to society. And then the defense has to feel sufficiently incentivized to take this deal, right? And so for an example, if you have a case, let's just say it's an economic crime, right? It's some sort of embezzlement and you're facing 30 counts of embezzlements, right? So there's just different occasions, maybe over the course of months where a person is stealing from their employer. Every time they steal might be a different count, right? And so the DA, as part of the negotiations in that case, they might say, okay, we've charged you with 30 counts. we're going to offer for you to plead guilty to counts 1 through 5. We're going to dismiss counts 6 through 30, and we're offering you 365 days in jail, right? And so you may say, hey, man, for a first-time offender, 365 days in jail, that's a lot. Okay, yeah, that's a lot. But if you go down at trial on all 30 of these counts, then maybe your exposure is 5 years or 10 years in jail or in prison, right? And if your exposure is 5 to 10 years in prison, then 365 days doesn't sound so bad, right? So then you take that deal, right? Maybe you have a violent crime, right? And you're charged with assault by means likely to cause great bodily injury, right? Which is a serious violent offense, and maybe you're facing 3 years in prison for that offense. They may make you an offer to a simple battery, right? And then, just because there might be evidentiary issues, there might be witness issues, they make you an offer of a simple battery where you're just going to be on probation and maybe you don't have to do any time in jail at all. It's a first-time offense, so they actually want to give you a shot at being able to prove yourself instead of going to prison. That's going to be an attractive offer for somebody who might be facing 3 years in prison if they go down for this assault charge, right? So then they take the deal. Well, when we're talking about a case like this, right, a double homicide, a double murder, there's not going to be any offers on the table from the DA. The DA is not making any offers in these type of cases. And so that's typical when you have, it doesn't have to be a double murder. It can just be one murder, or it can even be an attempted murder. A lot of times the district attorney is not going to make any offers, so it's going to be on the defense to come to the table with their offer. So then when we think about it from a practical standpoint, this guy he's 32 years old, right? And it's my understanding he has no criminal history. So, there just wasn't going to be something that the defense would be able to put on the table that would be acceptable to the prosecution. You killed 2 people with a gun. You planned this. And so unless the defense was coming to the table with, say, a 50-year offer, right, which would make him 82 by the time he might get out, then there's not going to be any sort of deal. So when there's not any possibility for the defense and the prosecution to come to some sort of agreement as to how the case should get resolved, then those cases have to go to trial, right? So that's how it happens, right? If you're wondering, why are we even going through the motions on this? This is what happens, right? There is no deal that's going to be acceptable to the DA, and the defense isn't, for a person with little to no criminal history, it's hard to get somebody to sign a change of plea form and agree to a 50-year plea deal. It just doesn't happen. So these cases end up having to go to trial. And you might think this is a slam dunk for the prosecution, right? I mean, you've got a violent, jealous guy with anger issues and 2 dead bodies. I mean, it's pretty open and shut, right? But again, he has the constitutional right to go to trial and make the DA prove its case. I mean, we do not want to start chipping away at people's rights, right? Or even start to question people's rights because we don't like the person or we don't like what they're alleged to have done. And so it's really easy to criticize a lawyer defending someone in a case like this, right? But you just have to understand, she's there doing everything that she can just to make sure that he gets a fair trial and that he's treated fairly within the system. Mr. Abulaban's lawyer, I can guarantee you, she did not condone what he did. She did not, she wasn't going to the jail visits and high-fiving him and celebrating him for what he did. She's, looking at this file, probably felt some type of way about what ended up happening. But at the end of the day, she took an oath, and she's there to, again, protect her client's constitutional rights and make sure that he was treated fairly within the system. We as defense attorneys, we're there to make sure that somebody doesn't just get steamrolled by the government, right? That just because some overzealous prosecutor accuses you of doing something, that doesn't mean that, boom, it's just rubber stamped and you're automatically guilty. It's that checks and balances, right? Where we have an opportunity to confront and cross-examine witnesses against you, where we have an opportunity to go through the evidence and make sure that they can actually prove what they're saying that you did. Because I can tell you, I've had plenty of cases over the years where the DA might have bet their child's life that my client was guilty, but that is until they got an opportunity to hear the other side of the story, right? So based on my spending time with my client, going through the evidence, forming our defense strategy, and being able to either present that to the DA to help them understand that my client didn't do what he was alleged to have done, or, in trial, being able to show during trial that, hey, you weren't able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt because my client didn't do it. It's easy to criticize a lawyer in this situation, but at the end of the day, again, they're just upholding their duties as a defense attorney. So we had an interesting defense theory from his perspective, basically saying how, the gun was in his hand and the next thing he knows, he's shooting and he can't stop. It's almost like, he says he's outside of himself and he couldn't, understand that this was what he was doing in the moment. And there was some elements there where you would have that classic heat of passion defense where, a man walks in on his wife sleeping with another man, and then in a fit of rage, he then acts violently and either, commits some sort of assault with a deadly weapon or even a homicide. And ultimately, as a defense to a murder charge, the person would be arguing that they committed a voluntary manslaughter. And, just so you know, again, a voluntary manslaughter doesn't then mean that you get off scot-free and you're going home that day. No, a voluntary manslaughter, there's still prison tied to it, but the max sentence on a voluntary manslaughter is only up to 11 years, whereas, a murder charge carries a 25 to life, or, in this situation, based on the special circumstances, this guy was facing a life without possibility of parole. But when you're talking about heat of passion, there has to be some sort of event or some sort of provocation, right? There's something that would cause a reasonable person to react passionately and without, due deliberation, where you're not even, you're just acting on instinct. That person has to be under the influence of such intense emotion, right, that their judgment was completely clouded or obscured. And so that's why the classic example is the man walking in with his wife having sex with another man, because, in that moment, a person, can just lose it and act in rage. But this thing has to be immediate, right? It has to be immediate. If the guy walks in on his wife and then he goes back downstairs, opens the safe. It's like a combination. He opens the safe, grabs the gun, goes right back upstairs, and then, shoots both a woman and her lover. Then, there's a cooling off period, right? If you've had an opportunity to think through your actions, then you're not able to use the heat of passion defense. The way that it would be, probably more believable or sellable to a jury would be if the guy walks in and then maybe grabs a lamppost that's actually in the bedroom at the time. So he walks in, just grabs the lamppost and starts beating his wife and his lover, potentially to death. In that situation, he might say that, he was acting under the heat of passion and be able to go to voluntary manslaughter. But I think the major issue that the defense was trying to argue was that it should be perhaps second-degree murder versus first-degree murder, and that can be the defense, where you're not saying that your client didn't actually do what they're alleged to have done in terms of actually killing the people or killing the person, but you're saying that it wasn't premeditated and deliberate, right? So it's just kind of spontaneous or on the fly. And the DA's position was that, no, this was not heat of passion at all. This was absolutely a setup. I mean, you guys were separated. She had you move out. You had copied a key. You broke into the apartment. You put in this listening device, right? You heard something that you didn't like. You went into the apartment with a loaded gun, and this was not some sort of spur of the moment thing. You committed 2 murders in cold blood, and now you will die in prison as a result. And so again, this is just such a tragedy, and again, one that could have been avoided. Signs were there. I mean, there was an incident where he had apparently convinced his sister not to call the police after he had beat up Anna. And maybe if the police had been called, maybe if he had been arrested, we wouldn't be here talking about this case today. And that's what police are thinking about when they actually do make domestic violence arrests. They're trying to prevent something like this from happening in the future. But yeah, so the sentencing is continued, and that's going to be a very emotional event. If you saw when the court clerk was delivering the verdict, when they said that he was guilty of the murders and with the use of firearm allegation, the gallery erupted. So people were cheering in the back, and the judge had to, hey, calm down, order in the court. You guys need to be quiet. This is still a courtroom. That sentencing hearing is going to be filled with emotion. I can guarantee you there will be numerous people in there giving statements on how this has impacted their life, how much they miss Anna, how much they miss Rayburn, how much this has been just a tragedy that they'll have to live with for the rest of their lives. And, there's almost nothing more emotional than being in a criminal courtroom in a sentencing where there has been a murder. So that's it for this tragic story. If you got something out of this video, please show me some love and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.